Welcome back to the IEA's podcast, Everything Energy. I'm Dan Hewitt. This week we're asking where the world's electricity supply comes from. For billions of people around the world, electricity is a part of daily life that can be taken for granted. If you flick a switch, you expect a light to come on, and when that doesn't happen, the disruptions can feel profound. This year's blackouts from Spain and Portugal to Chile were stark reminders that without electricity, daily life itself can grind to a halt. We know the demand for electricity is growing faster than overall energy demand, but where are we getting our electricity from right now, and which sources are growing fastest? Here to help me find out is electricity analyst from the IEA, Eren Chan. Okay, Eren, thanks so much for joining us today. Now, we've had other podcasts in the past looking at how the world uses electricity, so that's the demand side, but this is very much on the supply side, so where we get our electricity from. So to begin with, just in basic terms, can you just remind us what electricity is, the process of electrification, how does it work?
I mean, electricity is essential for our modern life, of course. But when you look at the generation, so the production of electricity, how it is done, we are seeing things a bit changing. So traditionally, electricity is generated at a power plant. You have turbines rotating, which then drive generators that then produce electricity. And this rotation of turbines, they can be achieved via combustion of fossil fuels or nuclear fission. But also in the case of hydropower, for example, we have water flowing basically through the turbines and then spinning these turbines. So this is, let's say, the way electricity is traditionally produced. But for example, solar photovoltaics, we have also these type of power plants. They convert sunlight directly into electricity using semiconductors. Traditionally, we had these large power plants which generated this electricity, which was then produced across large distances via high voltage transmission lines. And then you would reduce the voltage with using transformers and then distribute it to neighborhoods and our homes. Now we are seeing a shift to decentralization. So there's a lot of distributed assets, so solar PV farms, wind turbines located, for example, in more remote locations. Then you need to build the grids for these and transport this electricity. And at the same time, households have solar PV modules on their rooftops, so they can be consuming electricity while they're also producing electricity. So this means, of course, that our system is now becoming much more decentralized. So in this new system, flexibility, storage, and digitalization will, of course, be essential.
Okay, so we've defined our terms. Let's talk about the global energy mix. So how much the world's energy, or the way that the world powers itself, how much of that currently comes from electricity? How much of it comes from other sources?
Globally, about 1/5, so 20% of all energy is delivered in the form of electricity, and the rest is consumed directly as fuel. So this is oil, natural gas, coal, biomass, and of course the sectors are transportation, heating, cooking, and industrial processes. Now, these sectors I mentioned are still largely dominated by fossil fuels, but we are seeing a gradual shift towards electrification. So, for example, electric vehicles in transportation are becoming much more common. Heat pumps in heating, for example, is also very relevant, and we are seeing more and more of such components being installed. When you look at electricity use globally, we see that it has increased twice the pace of overall energy demand over the last decade. And for example, if you look at China, 2/3 of the global increase in electricity demand over the past decade came from China alone.
And I just want to dig into a stat you said there, which was 20% of global energy use comes from electricity. I think people will be surprised to hear that actually that number is so low. Maybe you could just explain a bit more about, well, what's happening with that other 80%.
So when you use your, let's say, mobile phone, you charge it, or you use your laptop, you charge your electric vehicle, you use this electricity. So the direct use of energy in this case is electricity. And this makes about 20% of your total energy consumption as the end user, which means the remaining 80% is coming from other fuels. For example, for heating, it may be natural gas. For transportation, you may be combusting oil. In some other end-use cases, maybe you are burning coal. So again, this makes up 80% currently.
Right, let's dig in a little bit more into the global electricity mix. What are the sources that make it up? Where does it all come from?
As of 2024, the largest contributor to global electricity mix was coal. So coal-fired generation had a share of 35%. And then we have total renewable generation at 32%. So renewables, they include hydropower, wind, both onshore and offshore, solar PV, as well as geothermal and various other renewable technologies. When we come to gas-fired generation, the share was about 22%. And then the rest is what we term as other non-renewables. So this includes oil and then various other like waste-based electricity generation. This was about 3%.
Now, people may or may not be surprised to hear that it's coal that tops that list. And in some ways, the story of electricity is the story of using coal. I wonder if you can give us some reasons why that could be the case.
Yeah, I mean, traditionally, coal has been a major source of electricity. Much of the 19th and 20th centuries, it was the story of electricity was closely tied with the coal. And this has various reasons. First of all, coal was relatively cheap and abundant. Depends on the region, of course, but so the price made it attractive. Also, when you look at coal compared to traditionally used other resources, wood or peat, coal is a much more energy-dense product. So it has a lot of energy per kilogram compared to wood or biomass, for example. And also this made it, of course, efficient to transport coal across long distances, and you could also store it. Another thing is, I think, worth mentioning the infrastructure which developed around the Industrial Revolution. So it was already based on coal. So coal mining, coal transport, and labor around this commodity was already developed. So this existing infrastructure advantage meant that in the power plants, coal was also the main source of fuel.
And just one more question on coal. Maybe you could tell us, what are the regional differences? So when you look around the world today, how people are generating electricity, who is generating the most electricity through coal?
So still, we have seen coal increasing. For example, 2024, global coal-fired generation was about 10% higher than a decade ago. And this is happening despite substantial declines in various economies. In the United States and in Europe, we have seen very big declines in coal-fired generation, but these have been offset by strong increases in China, India, and various other emerging economies in Asia. Renewables, and also in addition to nuclear energy generation, are increasing strongly, constraining coal-fired generation in many regions. Renewables are surging globally, and actually we expect renewable electricity generation to surpass that of coal at the end of 2025 or latest by 2026. And this is especially driven by the rapid expansion of ever cheaper solar PV technology. And over the next 3 years, actually, roughly 600 terawatt hours of additional electricity will be generated from solar each year. What does this mean? This is amount of electricity from solar PV alone equivalent to Korea's annual electricity consumption.
Okay, you mentioned a bit about how fast electricity generated by renewable energy, how fast that's growing. Now, maybe you could compare the price point of renewable electricity with that comes from coal. What are the differences there? Are they comparable?
The costs of renewable energy, so when we look at solar PV and wind, we have seen very substantial cost declines over the last decade. So We use for this to measure this a term called levelized cost of electricity. But here, when you look at this metric, the cost of solar PV declined almost by 80% and wind by 60% over the last decade. And in many regions now, solar PV and wind are now actually, when you look at the LCOE metric, cheaper than large-scale conventional generators. So this can be coal power plants or combined cycle gas turbines, and it makes it attractive to install these technologies. However, one thing I also like to underline, comparing different technologies with each other, with the LCOEs, may be sometimes misleading because ideally we need to also take into account total system costs, which includes the cost of integrating these generating technologies. So this can be, for example, the cost of grids and other components that can affect the system cost.
Okay, so we're living in an era where renewables, they're making up a bigger portion of our electricity mix. But of course, that brings the issue of variability. So how can countries, how can governments, how can they manage that?
So how do we manage the variability? I mean, it's already being managed currently mostly with conventional power plants, so more flexible assets, ramping up, like, gas-fired power plants, gas turbines, quite flexible. They can ramp up when there's, let's say, less renewable generation. But also we have storage technologies which are very essential. Pumped hydro power plants are already a major technology, and they're being used across different regions. But also flexible demand is one key lever. I think we need to emphasize it because much of this is currently untapped. And what do I mean by this? This is basically, for example, in industrial processes, you can shift certain processes depending on, for example, power price signals. So when the prices are low, when the renewables are producing a lot, prices are low, and you would, for example, shift your process to consume more of this energy. And when the opposite is the case, when the prices are high because there's not enough renewables, for example, you would then consume less. So this shifting of consumption is possible in certain processes, but also in the households, you can charge your electric vehicle accordingly in a smart manner to make use of this.
Let's turn to nuclear energy now, because we've actually discussed in other podcasts and raised the question about whether nuclear energy is making a comeback. So what are the stats, what does the data tell us about how much of our electricity currently comes from nuclear power and how that's changed in the last decade or so?
So in 2024, nuclear energy generated about 2,800 terawatt hours of electricity globally, which is equivalent to 9% of global total electricity generation. So nuclear has already a very significant share. And when we look at upcoming power plants, restarts, we see that nuclear power generation globally is on track to reach a new record high in 2025 and also keep increasing in 2026 as well. So this is driven by restarts in Japan, as well as robust output in the United States and France, and also the commissioning of new reactors, for example, in China, India, Korea, along other countries.
Now, if we want to increase the amount of our energy that comes from electricity, what are some of the roadblocks that stand in the way of that happening? So what are some of the issues and the problems that policymakers and everyone else needs to consider?
I mean, one, I think, important aspect we need to mention is the high upfront capital costs in certain generation technologies. So this financing aspect is important here, and it is already an issue, a challenge in emerging economies sometimes to finance such projects because the cost of capital can be quite high. There are various methods to remedy this. So certain de-risking measures, risk-sharing arrangements can be, of course, very beneficial. Another thing is the regulatory barriers. If the regulation is very complicated, it can cause delays to generation technologies. And this is already a big challenge at the moment. For example, about 1,500 gigawatts of global renewable projects are in waiting queues of course, accelerating this permitting process can really contribute to the deployment pace. Another thing is the grids. So grids are already becoming a bottleneck in many regions. So traditionally, of course, we have these distributed assets. We are trying to connect them to the grid. But at the same time, now we are seeing an increasing demand coming from, for example, data centers, which is also needed to be connected. And the grids in that sense are already becoming quite congested, and connection queues are becoming also very high, both on the supply and the demand side. And building additional grids, of course, requires, a lot of planning, a lot of investment, and it can take, in some advanced economies, actually about 4 to 8 years to build out high voltage line. In addition to this, we have supply chain bottlenecks emerging. One example is, I think, transformers. So transformers, we use them to increase or decrease the voltage so that electricity can be transported and then safely provided to consumers. So there are already a very high backlog in transformers. Now the bottleneck is emerging. Both the prices, backlogs, and import values for transformers have surged in the last few years. So there's a lot of demand for that. And a similar issue is also now emerging for gas turbines, for example. Gas turbine supply chain is also becoming stretched. And for example, if you were to order a new gas turbine now, you would very likely not get it before 2030.
So electricity demand is growing faster than overall energy demand. So give me some reasons for optimism that the supply of electricity is going to be able to meet that demand.
So we see low emission sources, renewables and nuclear energy together, and gas-fired generation rising in the next years to meet this growth in electricity demand globally. But at the same time, we need to also build out storage, increase the flexibility of the system. So this can be both on the supply side, but also on the demand side. So because integrating these assets will require flexibility, and then, of course, also building out the grids and using the existing grids also in a more optimal manner will be very essential.
Okay. Eren Shem, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dan.